One of the difficult problems of survey responses is the problem of how hard the respondent is willing to work to create answers to your questions. You know, a survey question might seem completely obvious. How many children do you have, for example? Hopefully that doesn't take a whole lot of effort on most respondents' behalf. But think about a typical political survey, one that's asking about, say, financial regulation reform. Now, for some of us here in the class, we think about these kinds of political issues every day, many times a day. But there are others of you here in the class who are not in political science who might not think about those issues all the time. You might have better things to do with your life. When we go to the mass public and the average survey respondent, a lot of political questions are far beyond their day-to-day experience, their day-to-day concern and focus. And so when you're asking them questions about financial regulation reform, you run into, first of all, the problem of simple ignorance, that many respondents may not know anything about the topic you're asking about. Now, in an ideal world, I suppose, we'd like them to always just say, I don't know the answer to that question. But a lot of surveys push. They say, well, if you had to take a guess, what would you do? Think of that from the perspective of the workload of the respondent. How hard do they have to work in creating an answer to this question? Or take someone that knows a little bit more, but not a lot. Someone that knows there was a financial meltdown, maybe knows that Congress is debating what to do about it, but certainly doesn't know the details of the bill before the Senate or the bill before the House, let alone what the conference committee is doing with that. For that sort of respondent, trying to formulate an answer is either a very difficult, time-consuming, psychologically consuming process, or it's one they may well choose to blow off, to just answer with the first thing that comes to mind, or just pick a response that was offered on the survey. Finally, we get some respondents who are so involved in the question, they know exactly what they think, they can provide those answers in a hurry, and they're closely related to that person's true attitudes or behaviors. This element of the survey response and how the attributes of the individual's own interests, involvement, how much they've thought about issues, and whether the questions are close to home or not, are an important part of the survey response, the psychology of the survey response. And they depend on things like question wording as well. They interact with question wording. So a moment ago I gave you the example of someone who doesn't pay much attention to politics having a hard time knowing anything about financial regulation reform. Well, does your question say, do you favor or oppose the Senate bill for financial regulation reform? Or did it say, do you favor or oppose the bill, or haven't you thought much about that? Or don't you have an opinion about that? By adding the haven't you thought about or explicit don't know option, we encourage those respondents to pick those easy alternatives. Now, the tricky part is, what about the subject that knows a little bit about it and might have to work hard to give you a good answer, but who could? Once you've invited them to opt out the easy don't know or the haven't thought much about it, you dramatically reduce their workload. And so here's why this is not a trivial question. Is it the case that you get better responses by offering an honest haven't thought much about it? Or do you get equally valid, maybe better responses by not giving subjects an easy way out of hard questions? Turns out this is not an easy question to answer. We'll spend a good deal of time talking about that as we talk about issues of the psychology of response and of questionnaire design. That idea of respondent workload and how it needs to be considered in the construction of every survey is a really critical part of survey analysis. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about analysis. Polling can be used for extremely sophisticated and fancy statistical methods, but we're going to stay away from those topics in this class. In the first place, they require a level of statistical training that I'm absolutely not assuming for this class. But the other reason is that those fancy statistical methods build on the much more fundamental issues that we're addressing in the class: sampling design, margin of error, question wording or question order effects, and so on. I want us to spend time in here talking about those more fundamental issues of interpretation and analysis. But some of them are so commonly misunderstood that I think there's a huge value added in dealing with them in the first place. Just to give you a simple example, when is a difference really a difference? Very often in reporting, say, President Obama's approval rating, we'll hear a report that says President Obama's approval rating today was 51%. That's down 2 points from the last survey, or up 3 points from the last survey. But when are those differences actually statistically significant? And when are they well within the margin of error for a survey? Or let's take another example as we come up on the 2010 elections. When is a candidate really ahead? A lot of reporters seem to believe that if the difference between the front runner and the second place candidate is within the margin of error, then there's not a difference. That's basically right. But it also turns out that the margin of error is not a good guide to the difference between the front runner and the second place candidate. How do you accurately and correctly compute that? Turns out it's bigger than the published margin of error, but that's something that very few reporters who should know the difference don't. And the average consumer of polls certainly doesn't understand those technical differences. One of my goals in the analysis section of the class is to give you the skills for how to compute those things, how to do them correctly, and how to reach the correct conclusion about, did the poll show that Smith is leading Jones? Or is the poll really not so precise that we can know whether Smith is ahead of Jones or the other way around? So we'll talk a good deal about that.